Alright, lesson 6.5 is graphing square root and cube root functions. Now in this lesson what we're actually going to be concentrating on is we're actually going to be graphing two graphs. So first of all, we're going to be graphing the square root of x and the cube root of x. And if you notice, when you do the cube root of x, okay, so we'll go ahead and graph this out. So if I pick values for x, y, I get 0, and the square root of the 0 is going to give me 0. I pick 1, square root of 1 is 1. 2, square root of 2 is about 1.4. And then if I do 3, the square root of 3 is going to be approximately 1.73. And then the square root of 4 gives me 2. Okay. Now, if I did any negatives, remember, I can't take the square root of a negative number. So those actually don't work. So plot this out. I get 0, 0, 1, 1, about 1.4, 1.73, and then 4 is going to give me 2. So you quickly find out that the graph of this thing actually ends up looking like a half a u. Okay? When you take the cube root of something, when I take the cube root, so let's go ahead and find those real quick. So we'll do several of these. So if I find the cube root of 0, well, the cube root of 0 is 0. 0 times 0 times 0 is going to give me 0. Okay? 1, the cube root of 1 is actually going to give me 1, because 1 times 1 times 1, okay, so it gives me 1. So let's try 2. So the cube root of 2 is actually going to give me 1.25. Okay? And I could go ahead and jump to the 8, and I know the cube root of 8 will give me 3. Okay? Now on a cube root, remember, I can pick a negative, because I'm multiplying a positive, or a negative times a negative gives me a positive, and then that positive times a negative will actually give me a negative. So I could actually go ahead and pick a -1, and it's going to give me a -1. And if I go ahead and just jump to -8, the cube root of that's going to give me a -2. So when I graph this thing, I graph 0, 0. I graph 1, 1. Okay, I could graph that 1.25. And then if I jump down here to 8, that's when it's going to hit the 2 mark. And then if I do the negative, -1, and then if I jump down to my 8, okay, and you quickly find out that this thing actually ends up looking like, kind of like, I call it an S curve. Okay, so the cube root's actually going to look like an S curve. Okay, so when we actually go to graph these things, there's a couple of things that you have to remember. And those things that you have to remember is, first of all, the index. And remember, on a square root, if you notice, the form pretty much looks the same, with the exception of the indexes. This one here has an index of 2. This one has an index of 3. Okay? So whenever you find in the index, the only thing the index is going to tell me is, the index is going to tell me the shape of the graph. Okay? So the square unit is going to have a half shape, or a half U-shaped, and the cube root is going to have that laid down S shape. Okay? The H, on the other hand, is going to tell me how the graph moves horizontally. In other words, it's going to tell me how the graph moves left to right. Now, this is where it does get a little tricky. If you remember back last unit, when we were actually graphing absolute value back in unit 1, and you remember that the H always lies to us, so you've got to remember that under the radical sign, we want this thing to go to 0. So the only way to make a positive H go to 0, I'm sorry, a negative H go to 0, is to make it a positive H. Okay, so the positive H is going to, if it's a negative, if this is a positive, then we're going to move to the left. Okay, so we're basically going to do the opposite of whatever the H says. And this, since this is a negative, if it's a negative, then we're going to go to the right that many units, okay? Now the k and it's the same thing for the cube root. Now the k on the other hand, it's going to tell us how the graph moves vertically. And after it tells us how it's going to move vertically, it actually is going to tell us the truth. So if it's a positive, we are going to move the graph up. If it's a negative, we're going to move the graph down. Alright, so let's take a look at this example. Now, first of all, you need to identify that since this one is a square root, then the graph of this thing is going to be our half of a u. Okay? And the point that we're going to start off with is, if you look, inside is going to tell us that we need to move horizontally. Okay? So in other words, we're going to go +2, 0. So instead of starting at the origin, we're actually going to start at the point 2, 0. Okay? This gives us our x-coordinate, tells us that we're moving right or left. And since there's no plus out here, we're going to leave it at 0. So since we want the opposite, we go start here. We just go over here. We're going to start at 2, 0. And then it's going to be our half a u. Okay? Alright, so let's take a look at another one. Now this one is a square root, so we know it's going to be a half a u. And our point that we're going to start off, instead of the origin, since it says +4, we have to do the opposite. So it's a -4. And since there's no plus k out here outside the radical sign, then we're going to start at -4. So if we go to the origin, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it's going to be our half a u. Okay? Alright. So now when it's outside, since there's no plus or minus on the inside, it's going to be a 0. Since this is a -3, and the part that's inside actually does tell us the truth. Okay, so it's going to be the square root of x -3. So I do 0, 1, 2, 3. I have to go down this time. And then we get our half a u shape. Okay? Alright, so the next one. So basically, really the only thing we're concerned about on this graph is how does the graph shift from from its original graph of just the square root of x. Okay, so since this one's outside, our x-coordinate is 0. Remember, it tells the truth if it's outside, so it is a +5. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I get my half a u shape. Okay, now I can combine these, so I actually have one inside and one outside. So if that's the case, remember, inside's going to tell me the truth. Let's make that 6 a little better. And then the outside is actually going to tell me the truth, so I stick with my -4. So my graph in this case is going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to go to the left 6 and then down 4, and then we're going to make my half a u. Okay? All right, now the only difference is when we're dealing with a cube root is the fact that it's going to give us that S-shaped instead of just the half a u. So remember, when we had just the cube root of x, everything started at the origin. Now, our graph's going to change. And since this says a -3, I'm going to change it to a +3. And it's going to give me a 0. Okay? So I want 1, 2, 3, 0. And then I get my S shape. Okay? When I'm graphing this thing. Okay? So if I had a plus inside, the only thing that would change about it is, remember, this goes to a -2, 0. So my initial point is going to be on the x-axis at -2, and then I make my S shape. Okay? All right. And if it's outside, remember the outside is going to move me up or down. So since I don't have there's not a plus or minus, it's 0. Outside tells me the truth. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves the graph up. And I get that S shape. Okay? All right. So the next one, remember there's no plus or minus, so it's 0. Outside tells the truth, so my point's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And there's my S shape. Okay? All right. And the last example, we can do both of them at the same time. So remember, inside lies to me. The outside tells me the truth. So it's going to be a -2 and a -3. So I get -2, 1, 2, 3, and I go down 3. And then I get my S shape. Okay. All right. Well, that concludes lesson 7.5.